everybody, Julie Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. If you saw my recent Mrs. Claus video and my retro oven video, you're probably wondering how I made all the teeny tiny little edible details and other embellishments like the wall clock behind the oven to deck out those projects. Well, you're in luck because in this video I'm going to show you how to make many of them. Specifically, I'm going to talk about how to make little royal icing and fondant plates like these, which can be used to put little chocolate chip cookies on them as we used on Mrs. Santa, or larger plates on which to put turkeys, as I did on the oven video. I'm also going to be showing you in the first segment where I talk about the plates how to make slightly larger plates or pie pans to make pumpkin pies, and then even larger bowls using the same method to make little bowls of peas and carrots or whatever else you might like. I used all of these embellishments here on my oven, and I would say this, even if you don't do the 3D oven projects or Mrs. Claus projects, all these little accessories are great as individual elements that can be put on a regular two-dimensional cookie. So think of it that way and get creative. And also take away the techniques because they can be applied to making other miniature foods or other miniature things for other cookies. The second item that we'll be talking about is how to make the cookies and the cookie sheets that were part of the oven video. We'll move on to the turkey. I'll show you how I form him, and we'll put him on one of the plates we did in the beginning. And lastly, I'll talk about how to make these wall clocks, which are very similar to the mini clocks that I used on my oven cookie. Before I move on to the first, though, and while I'm still on the subject of clocks, I wanted to mention that I've got a fabulous giveaway that you'll hear more about at the end of this video. It's just in time for the New Year's. And then what I'll be giving away is what I'm calling this timeless timepiece by JORD watches. They're made out of wood, the entire band, and they're just masterful works of art. And I'm giving away this one with a splashy pink background, which is part of their Cora series, a $275 retail value typically. I absolutely fell in love with these watches when I first learned about them not more than a few months ago. One, I love the artistry of them. Two, they're handcrafted here in the US and in St. Louis, Missouri, which is my hometown of all places. And they're just wildly versatile. They have watches for women as well as for men. I've since bought about 5 different watches for the combination of me, my spouse, and various other people. And I typically can't decide which to wear on any given day, as you'll see from the photo I've got floating overhead. But today I settled on this particular one with a green face. I thought it was very fitting and tying into my Christmas theme here today. So there'll be more details about the giveaway, specifically how to enter at the end of the video, so please stay tuned. So in this first segment, we're going to be covering how to make these plates, as well as how to make the pies, which are kind of an extension of the plate. And I'll talk briefly about how to make these lovely little bowls of peas and carrots if you should be so inclined to take the pies up a step. For the plates, in terms of what you'll need, basically you'll need a little mold. These are about 1 3/8 inch across. I'll have all the dimensions in the video description. This is for creating a royal icing bottom of the plate, if you will. Once it's dry, it's going to look something like that. You'll need some fondant for the rim, some stamps, a stamp pad, some red food coloring, and some cookie cutters to create the rim. Now for the pie, these are all the various things you'll need. You'll need the same little footed mold. It's footed in the sense that it's flat on the bottom. So it's got a little flat bottom to it. And I'll have sources in the video description. You'll need some gray royal icing to fill it up. White royal icing here, of course. A little bit of pumpkin colored royal icing to create the pumpkin pie on top. And then a thicker kind of caramel colored icing to pipe the crust. We're also going to embellish it a bit with a little bit of luster spray. This will be sprayed on the pie pan itself to make it look like silver. And we're going to be embellishing the top with a little bit of dusting of cocoa powder, which you see here. And I may throw in a few extra little surprises along the way. I've got my white royal icing. It's a relatively thick flooding consistency. I want it as thick as possible, but for it to still settle flat, because if it's too loose, it's going to take forever to dry. Any royal icing in a silicone mold takes a long time to dry because the mold does not breathe, so it stays very damp underneath for quite a long time. It could be a week. I typically make these a week before I want to use them, if not longer. So the thicker the icing, the better. I'm just going to pump it into the bottom of the mold. Not very deep. I just want a slight contour to it, and then shake it and set that aside to dry. And again, it might take quite a while, but once it's ready to come out, it literally will pop out. And I'm keeping it fairly shallow profile, no more than 1/4 of an inch, probably even less for these plates. And that will create a nice little round shape, something similar to that, which we'll trim out with fondant. If you want an oval shape, then I would suggest creating royal icing transfers like this is, drawing out ovals and then tracing over them with the royal icing. And then you can create a plate of a different shape, or a much bigger plate if you don't have a mold of this size. So let's talk about how to put on the fondant trim. We'll just do that on the little round one because the process is the same for the oval. For this particular plate, I used a cutter, which is about 1 1/8 inches. And I'm just going to use the back side of a normal tip to cut the center out of it to create a rim. But first we want to stamp it. For that, I'm going to my stamp pad, which was at one time uninked, but I'm going to be inking it with food coloring, the same stuff I color my royal icing with. Blotting off the excess. Make sure it's nicely inked, just looking at the bottom. And then press it into the fondant. Press evenly across the entire surface to make sure it makes good contact everywhere. And that looks great. Center my cutter over the pattern as best as possible. Pop it out. And then use this piece to cut the inside part. So it's the exact same process to create the oval rim of this particular size. I would just stretch it to fit this particular piece, as you can see. But instead we're going to put it on here, and to do that I affix it with a little bit of corn syrup, as I always apply fondant to either cookies or to royal icing transfers. My transfer is now completely dry, so I'm just going to put a little corn syrup down. And then you might want to give this a touch of drying time so you don't smudge the food coloring on top, but I didn't have much excess, so I'm just going to stretch it, conform it to the round shape, because I did make it a little bit oval while the fondant is still moist. And I'm putting it on the back side, the flat side of the transfer, if you will, so the plate has a little bit of height. And that's all there is to it. So the pie starts the same way the plate does, but with gray icing in the same mold. Again, it's about a 1 3/8 inch mold across, and I'll have the source in the video description. But the only difference is I'm going to pipe it a little bit deeper, so I might even use slightly thicker icing so that it doesn't take forever to dry. Certainly about 1/4 of an inch deep, like so. Shake it flat. You might want to tap out any peaks. And set that aside to dry. Once it's dried, ta-da! This now has been at least a week. They'll pop right out, like so. There may be some discoloration, but we're going to spray this, so no big deal. The deeper it is, the longer it takes to dry, and the more the icing spots and mottles and does strange things. So that's a nice shallow pie plate. By contrast, here's one that's piped a little bit deeper, which would make more of a deep dish pie. We are going to work with the shallow one and then take it to this step. To do that, I simply spray it with Pearl PME spray, which I'm not going to do because that gets everywhere. You've seen me spray in other videos, and that's going to give it a nice shine. Once that's dry, which will be an instant if you spray it lightly, I'm taking pumpkin colored icing. This is a beadwork consistency, maybe a thick flooding consistency, maybe not quite as loose as beadwork, because I want it to have a little poof to it. And I am just going to flood the center of the pie pan pretty close to the edge, but I want to leave a little bit of edge because I need to leave room for crust. And I have it thick enough that it won't hopefully flow off. At this point, while the icing is still soft, I just want to knock a little bit of cocoa powder on it to look like it's dusted with cinnamon. So I'm just taking a dry brush, dusting it in cocoa powder, taking off the extra so I don't get a big dump in the middle. And then I'm just going to kind of, what do you call this? Hit the bristles to knock it off onto the pumpkin pie part. I think I'm taking off too much off of this brush. I want to get a little more over there. Okay, so that looks good. Then I would set that aside to dry. It doesn't have to completely dry, but it does need to crust to the point that there's a relatively firm outer shell before you go to the next step. Otherwise, you run the risk of putting a dent in your nice pumpkin pie. This one's completely dry all the way through, and you'll see a little bit of cocoa powder there for the cinnamon. The next thing I'm going to do is pipe the crust. For that, I've got kind of a light caramel colored icing of outlining consistency. It's pretty thick because I want it to hold its shape. And it's a mixture of golden yellow and brown and mostly white. And I can do different types of crusts. Here you'll see I have kind of a double-sided crust where I pushed out, pulled back, pushed out, pulled back, pushed out, pulled back, pushed out, pulled back, etc., etc. Here on this guy, I have more of a one-sided crust where I simply pushed out, pulled back, pushed out, pulled back, pushed out, pulled back, pushed out, pulled back. And you'll notice because the icing's thick, it's maintaining some distinction between these little beads, which is what I want. I'm going to do this single-sided bead on this particular piece. To facilitate piping, I've put it on a little shelf liner material, non-skid material, so my lightweight pie doesn't push all over when I pipe on it. So pushing forward to create a bead, pulling back, forward, back, and I'm going to try to kind of go over the edge of the pan a little bit, the way a real pie might. Now that looks like a pretty realistic pie with a kind of a blonde crust. If you don't bake your crust very long, that's how it will look. But to take it to the next level, if we want to give it a little browning, I've actually painted the crust. Once it's dried completely, I'll paint it with a mixture of brown and yellow food coloring. And I'm going to try to do that on this little crust here, just to give you an idea of what I mean. Here I'm using airbrush colors. You could also use regular liquid gel food coloring and probably thin it with a little extract or vodka because it doesn't need to be very thick for this. And you want it to dry very quickly. So I'm using a mixture of yellow and brown. And I'm using, any number of tools. Sponge brush, a little sponge brush would work. I'm just getting the edge of the crust here, and I've got a normal flat paintbrush now, and it's working very effectively. So I've got 3 different versions of the pie, one with a heavily caramelized crust, one where I used a much lighter mix of brown to yellow, and one that's just left blonde, and they all look equally good depending on the look you're going for. Just a quick little talk about the bowl here. This was done much the same way with gray royal icing in the mold, but very deep, almost to the top of the mold. And then I can pop it out, and you'll see a lot of discoloration here. But what I did was I airbrushed the bottom blue with blue food coloring. So once it was airbrushed with blue, I put a dollop of soft green royal icing on top, loaded it with green nonpareils for peas, and sliced orange confetti, sugar confetti, to look like sliced carrots. In this little mini project, I'm going to talk about how to make these teeny tiny cookie sheets, which aren't more than an inch wide, maybe less, and an inch and a half long. These were used on top of my retro oven project, so you can check that out if you haven't already. First, what you'll need for it, to make the cookies themselves, the mini chocolate chip cookies, you need a small amount of my royal icing putty, which is extremely thick royal icing, so thick that you can actually mold it, and you'll see me doing that in the next step. That'll form the cookie dough. We need some little tiny black sanding sugar for the chocolate chips. You can see how fine this is. This was the most challenging part of this mini project, was finding really fine black sugar or brown sugar that would actually simulate chocolate chips. And this is a Betty Crocker version. I'll have the link in the video description. So that's all you need for the cookies, as well as a little acetate lined sheet, cardboard, but we want to set the cookies on acetate so that they dry and pop off the acetate very easily. Then for the cookie sheets, you just need a little bit of gray rolled fondant to make the base of the sheet, a little bit of gray royal icing, which I have in my parchment cone to make some little edges on the cookie sheet, and some luster spray to give it some shimmer. Again, I'm going to be using the Pearl Luster Spray from PME. And then lastly, as an optional finishing touch, if you want to line your cookie sheet with parchment paper, I've got edible wafer paper, little rectangles of that cut to fit the cookie sheet. So for the chocolate chip cookies, just starting with my royal icing putty, which is super thick royal icing, even thicker than my icing glue. So thick that I can roll it into a ball and have it really not stick to my hands. If it is a little bit tacky, have some powdered sugar nearby to keep your hands dusted, or simply mix more powdered sugar into the mix here. I've colored my royal icing with a mixture of Buckeye Brown and golden yellow food coloring, both my Chef Master colors that I usually use in royal icing. And I've just got a small cake cardboard cut in half lined with acetate to press them onto so that once they dry, they pop off readily. So just shape them into tiny balls. The size will determine the size of the cookie you have. This is going to be certainly a much bigger cookie than those teeny tiny ones here because I am going to press it a little bit. Moisten your fingertip on a damp cloth. Get some sugar on it. And press it into the cookie. And that creates a pretty big cookie. That's more the size of the ones I used on the platter for Mrs. Claus in that video. For teeny tiny ones for the cookie sheet, I probably don't need to start with much more than that amount of royal icing putty. Again, there, moisten your fingertip on a damp cloth to pick up some sugar, and then stick it on the top of the cookie. When they're completely dry, the icing is very thick, so they will dry very, very quickly. And when they're completely dry, they will literally just usually pop themselves right off. There we go. They're all falling off, and we've got a bunch of little minis that'll fit perfectly on this cookie sheet. So let's talk about how to make the cookie sheet. So to make the cookie sheet, which is going to look something like this before it's sprayed, we need to roll out a little rolled fondant. And that looks nice and smooth. This particular cookie sheet, again, was sized really to fit my retro ovens, and it's about 1.5 inches long by 1 inch wide. So we're just going to trim one up. So just rule it out and cut a little rectangle. It's as simple as that. We want to pipe some little edges on it, little handles or sides, if you will. And I will just pipe a single line on each end of the cookie sheet. And it's okay if the color doesn't match exactly, because we're going to come back in and spray this with pearl spray to give it a silvery effect once it's completely dry. So the next goal is to give it to some machine. Typically I do a bunch all at once. I'm just going to spray one for you as an example. Again, using the PME edible luster spray, I like it because it goes down quick, fast, and evenly, as opposed to painting with a mixture of extract and dust, which will leave streaks sometimes. This will spray perfectly evenly. You just want to give it a good shake. And that's just enough to give it a little bit of luster. To finish off the cookie sheet, we can use the same gray royal icing we used. I'm just going to tack down a slip of parchment paper in a couple of areas, not using much royal icing because I want it to look like it's a little bit lifted, into the middle of the cookie sheet like so. On this particular cookie sheet here, I also aged the edges of the parchment paper so they look a little burned. I did that by just painting them lightly with a mixture of brown and yellow food coloring. But I kind of like them unburned because more often than not, parchment paper won't burn in the course of baking cookies. And then we're just going to tack down our little cookies we made earlier, fitting as many as we can across. And that's the basic process. This makes a sweet little adornment for my oven project. And I can imagine on a whole host of other kind of kitchen-oriented cookies. Baking themed set, for instance. There you have it. Okay, in this little mini turkey segment, I'm going to show you how I made the plated turkey from head to toe, so to speak. They went on my vintage and also inside my vintage oven project. We're going to start with one large oval plate. I showed how to make those plates in the first segment of this video. This is just a slightly larger version of it, sized to fit my turkey body. You'll need one domed turkey body. This was made by contouring a cookie, which I've shown in many other videos, and I also have a whole other video on how to contour cookie dough. I simply cut a round of cookie dough, shaped it over this mold, this particular mold, and when it was out of the oven, just fresh out of the oven before it had set, I smushed it a little bit to create an oblong form. So you'll need one of those. Then you'll want to dip it. Again, I have a whole other video about how to dip contoured pieces. We also dipped in my recent Mrs. Santa video. We dipped her head and body parts, so you might jump on over there and check that out. And that'll form the turkey body. It's all filed down. And then you'll need a little bit of similar colored royal icing putty. Again, very, very thick putty. We're going to use that to shape the drumsticks. So really where I'm going to pick up this project is in the shaping of the drumsticks and the giving of it more color. Once the drumsticks are shaped, it gets airbrushed or sponged with a combination of yellow and brown coloring to make it look like it's crisp out of the oven. And then we'll plate it up on that plate with some little mini potato transfers, royal icing transfers, and some piped herbs using green royal icing. Okay, so we're working on the turkey, getting the drumsticks on. I'm working with royal icing putty to make them, as I said. You could use fondant, but I figure if I'm dipping the cookie in the same color of royal icing, it's easy enough just to thicken it up by adding a lot of powdered sugar and use the same icing to create the little drumsticks that'll go on top. So I just modeled it the way you would kind of shape rolled fondant, and I like to work with it and continue to work with it when it's stuck onto the turkey body. You can just stick it on. It'll stick with the moisture in it. You don't need any additional water or anything. But I like to continue to shape it while it's on the turkey just to make sure it looks good. And here the end of the drumstick seems to be a little too thick, so I'm pushing it in sideways. And I want to push down on the top a little bit to give it a flare at the top. So I'm squeezing the center part, pushing down on the top to give a little flare to the leg, if you will. Now it may continue to droop as it dries, and I may need to continue to push it back up so it looks like it's upright. Alternatively, you can do more of the shaping on a flat surface and then stick them up later when they're a little more dry. But there's the risk of the piece cracking if you do that. So I'm getting a few little cracks in this piece. Oops, I think I anchored it a little too far forward. I'm going to anchor it back here. And so I've got a decent looking bird coming about. It's going to need some fussing and some drying time and lifting of those legs as it dries. So we'll set it aside and give it a little bit of time, and I'll modify the shaping as it continues to dry. Okay, so we want to give our very naked turkey some color as if it's been baking in the oven, and I find the best way to get an even coat of color down is to airbrush. I've got a mixture of airbrush colors in here, both a Chef Master Canary Yellow and some brown, probably more yellow than brown. But the key thing to do to get the color you want is simply to get it in your brush. I've mixed both in my cup and just test it on a piece of paper. If it's looking kind of the nice golden color that you want, that's good. I think I might want to touch more yellow in there, so I'm just going to add it to the cup. Give it a swirl and give it a few pumps through so the yellow comes through, and I think that looks pretty good. And I'm just going to gradually, low pressure, color the birds. And if some naked areas show, that looks good, because that's how a real turkey would look. But this is the general process, and I think the airbrushing just adds a good deal of lifelikness to it. And we might want to go a little darker down the center, a little heavier in the center on the top, so it looks like it would got more browning on the top of the bird as it normally would. And that's it. Okay, now that our bird is airbrushed and dried, we're ready to assemble him on the plate that we made earlier. Here's my airbrushed dried bird. And to do that, I'm just going to take a light colored icing, ideally white, but I've got some leftover light caramel color from making my pie crust, so I'm just going to use that. Kind of matches the turkey body as well. So I'm just going to put a little bit on the bottom and center this guy on my plate, like so. And that looks kind of pretty as it is. However, I want to deck it out further, being that more is more person as I am, to simulate what I've got here. It's got some sliced potatoes and herbs on it, and we'll just fill out the top and the bottom a little bit with some of that. Now, how did I do those sliced potatoes? Those are nothing more than royal icing transfers that I piped into sort of half hemispheres, half circles, if you will. And while they're still on the acetate, I took a brown edible marker and just drew a little bit of potato skin on them. So these are supposed to look like sliced roasted potatoes. It's easiest to do them while the pieces are still stuck to the acetate, because as you can imagine, otherwise they start scooching around and going everywhere. So I'll just do a few. They don't have to be perfect, because a little variability looks great on anything natural. But that's the general idea. And then once they're done, you can just take your paring knife and peel them off. They come off quite readily. I've got a bunch already done that I'll just pour out here, and we'll draw from those. So I'm going to start by gluing my potatoes down, and then we're going to fill in and around them with some herbs. Again, pretty random here is all that's needed. And I'm using a light icing so that if any shows, I can knock it off at the end with my trussing needle without it staining the fondant underneath. But I think that's enough potatoes for that area. Now I've got some green royal icing in a parchment cone. It's a mixture of green and brown, so it looks a little dull, like herbs. And I'm just going to open it up a tiny, tiny bit. It's of outlining consistency, and pipe some little details that look leaf-like. And I'm just going to start by piping a few little random lines in various places, and then we'll add leaves by piping on top of those lines. And once I've done that, I might cut this open just a touch more, and I'm going to put a few little leaves coming out of each side. So to do that, just basically piping a dot and then pulling back abruptly. Because it's a thick icing, it's going to leave a little peak at the end that looks leaf-like rather than a blob. And then that completes all of the turkey dressings for our lovely Thanksgiving bird, either to go in or on the outside of our vintage oven or on any other holiday cookie you could imagine. So the final accessory in this accessories video is not a faux edible, but rather one of the wall clocks that was sitting behind my retro oven in the little kitchen vignette that I created in an earlier video. Specifically, I had big wall clocks that looked like this and smaller ones that were of this scale. And I'm going to show you how to create these. The process is very similar to making the oven clocks that I made in the oven video, with the exception of a few little extra embellishments. So that's the end goal. What you'll need to create them are a cardboard that's been covered with acetate. This will be our piping surface for the royal icing transfers, which will look something like either these red or blue discs when they're done. You'll need a little bit of fondant to create a stamped clock face. I'm using white. I also used yellow on some of the clocks you saw there. You'll need some clock stamps. I've got two sizes here. We're going to be working with the smaller one today. Cookie cutters to cut the clock faces out of the fondant. And then, of course, some black food coloring and an uninked stamp pad to apply the food coloring to ink your stamp to create the clock face. So the first step is making that royal icing transfer. Again, I have a whole video that talks about how to make smaller transfers, but just so you don't forget, as a point of reminder, I've traced various size diameter circles under here. Obviously a larger one. This is about 1 3/4 inches for my largest clock, down to about 1 1/4 inches for my smaller ones. And we're going to do the smaller ones today. So there's a tracing piece of paper underneath to help as a guide, and then the acetate on top, and then the cardboard to give it some stability, so when I'm done I can just put it aside without messing up my transfers or bending them. So I've got a relatively loose icing, a relatively loose icing, though probably a thick flooding consistency. So maybe about a teaspoon of water for every cup of my glue. I don't want it so runny that it just flows everywhere. So this has a little bit of body, you can see. Right now I'm just pushing around the icing till it fills that form. And because it has some body, there's a little peak that's been left. I'm just going to knock that down. And I would go ahead and fill out all the others in a similar fashion. So they'll pull off the acetate quite easily. If they don't pull off the acetate quite easily, then again, just stick them aside at room temperature for another few hours, or set them in your food dehydrator set at 95 degrees Fahrenheit. They could dry, something this size could dry in probably under a half an hour in there. But again, the test is whether it peels off the acetate easily or not. On to making the clock face, which is going to be nothing more than stamped rolled fondant. I've already rolled mine through on the number 1 setting on my machine, which is still kind of thick. I want it to be a pretty low profile clock, so I'm going to take it to number 2 and then to number 3 before I stamp on it. Just gradually feeding it through the machine on successively narrower settings so that I don't tear the fondant. And that looks nice. So I've inked what was an uninked foam pad, and I'll have sources for these in the video description. It originally had no food coloring or anything of any kind on it, so it's food safe. And I use my food coloring on it that I normally use to color my icing. I'm just going to ink my little clock stamp here, making sure I've got good coverage everywhere. And then just press evenly into the block. This is a self-adhesive stamp that mounts to an acrylic block, which is kind of nice because I can see exactly where it's located on the fondant or on the cookie if I am stamping directly on a cookie, which is also possible. I'm just going to do a couple in case I mess one up. And those both look really nice. And then we're going to take a cookie cutter. This one, I believe, is just over an inch, and it frames it nicely with a little room to spare. So I want to get overhead and make sure it's centered before I cut down. That looks pretty good. And we'll do another one. But I think that looks good too. Now I like to apply these when they're still pliable so that they conform to the transfer that I made because it's a little curvy on top. Otherwise it will stick straight off the edge. And I'm just going to apply a little bit of corn syrup to the center of the transfer where I want it. You don't need a lot. And again, I'm using corn syrup instead of royal icing because the transfer will lay flatter. With royal icing underneath it, it might be a little lumpy. And then I'm going to before I drop it into the corn syrup, I want to make sure, looking overhead, that it's going to be roughly centered when I get it down, because once you get it down, it's pretty hard to move without stretching the fondant. And that looks pretty good. Now, before I press it all the way down, just one last glance to make sure it's centered. That looks great. I'm going to smush in the sides here that are a little rough with the edge of my paring knife to kind of round it out a little bit better. And we're going to then trim it up with a few little royal icing accents. And I'm just going to trim this out. That'll also neaten up any rough edges that were cut, if I can conceal them with dots. My last dot just fits. Just let those dots dry completely for about an hour, and then this would be ready to mount on some other cookie or on the backdrop of my vintage oven cookie. So before I race off to deck out the backdrop of my oven cookie with these clocks, let me remind you of my timeless timepiece giveaway that I talked about at the beginning of this video. Once again, I'm giving away this gorgeous JORD watch, spelled J-O-R-D. It's from their Cora series, and it's normally retailed at $275. So one lucky person has the chance of winning this fabulous wood watch. All you have to do is click on the link that you'll see on my video, and you'll be taken to a screen that looks like what's going to be on my video, and then follow the steps there. There are actually 5 different ways to enter to increase your chances of winning. The more ways you enter, the higher your odds of winning. So I encourage you to enter all 5 ways and to do so before January 7th, which is the close of the giveaway. So best of luck to all who enter. Happy New Year and live sweetly.